universal education, because universal education was by itself really designed to support three things. Universal education, because people were now living in urban areas, was to ensure they had literacy and numeracy at a very low level, nothing very fancy, to acculturate, and particularly in this continent, more perhaps even than in Europe, because there were large numbers of people coming, this is the turn of the last century, large numbers of people coming from all over, in that case, Western Europe. They were coming from war-torn countries, they were coming out of religious persecution, they were coming out of poverty, they were coming to create new lives. Part of what universal education was designed to do was to bring this community together. Not so different from what we have now, just from different parts of the world. And the third purpose of universal education was actually sorting and selecting, deciding who gets more of this universal education that we are providing, because it wasn't designed to say everybody gets it forever to the highest level possible. It was really everybody needs this much, and then a few need some more, and then a very small number of those need even more than that. So assessment at that time in history, and through most of the 20th century, was based on things like tests and exams and projects and all of the kinds of things that all of us have grown up with their purpose being helping decide who gets more. Because not everybody is going to get this whole educational opportunity. We've now moved into an era of what is termed high-quality education for all. It's even high-quality learning for all. It is that there's really a place for everyone, and that people need to have education to be able to move forward. That's an essential part of their future. How many of you, just by a show of hands, how many of you grew up in families where your parents said, whatever I do, you'll have more education than I did? Yeah. That's part of our century, that having more education is the ticket. It's the currency that gets you ahead. So we're now in an environment where high-quality education for all is the purpose. It isn't sorting and selecting. And assessment is no longer who gets more, but assessment takes on a different cast in this high-quality education for all environment. And the cast that it takes on is what Paul Black talks about in the power of assessment to enhance learning. It's a quote that Paul Black has in one of his books, that improvement in student achievement from high-quality formative assessment has the potential to raise a school in the lower quartile, he's in England, of the UK national performance tables to well above average. High-quality formative assessment is actually proving to be one of the most powerful tools for learning. So I'm going to tell you a little story to try to demonstrate this. It's a story about my niece. My niece's name is Joanna. She hates that I tell this story because she's now 17 and about to go off to university next year. And it happened when she was 4 or 5 years old. And Jojo came to me one day and she said, you know, Aunt Lorna, all cats are girls and all dogs are boys. That's kind of interesting. I said, how do you know that? How do you know cats are girls and dogs are boys? Now, just an aside, I've discovered, having told this story many times, that there are a lot of adults who still somewhere in their brains believe that cats are girls and dogs are boys. But I asked Jo, how do you know that? And she said, well, you have a cat, and her name's Molly, and she's a girl, and she's little and smooth. You know, girls are little and smooth, cats are girls. And there's a dog who lives next door. I don't remember what his name is, but he's big and he's rough. He's a boy. Dogs are boys. Boys are big and rough. Yeah. It's pretty sophisticated logic. And this is what we try to get kids to do, isn't it? Have a hypothesis, test it with evidence. If it holds, you've got supporting evidence. So I thought about it for a minute. I thought, I could probably say to her at this point, it's not really like that. Cats can be girls and boys, and so can dogs. And she would have accepted it. She likes me. I'm a kind of favorite aunt, so she would have said, yeah. But she probably would go away thinking to herself, I have to remember when I talk to Aunt Lorna that she thinks cats can be boys and girls. Or she might be thinking, I'm not talking to Aunt Lorna about the sex stuff anymore because she clearly doesn't get it. But how many of your kids sit in your classrooms saying, I have to remember that that's what the teacher thinks? And how long do they have to remember it? Till the test. How many of you have things stored in your brain you still don't understand, that you can't get rid of, that you had to remember for the test, that are still there floating around without anything that hooks them? The story goes on like this. What I did do with Jo at that point was, instead of telling her, I showed her a book. You've probably all seen it. It's a coffee table book. It's a big book. It's just called Dogs. It's got all kinds of pictures of dogs in it. I showed her a picture of a Chihuahua. What's this? It's a dog. Boy or girl? It's a boy. Dogs are boys. Yeah. But it's little and smooth. Yeah. Sometimes they can be little and smooth. So one criterion out the window. Showed her a picture of a big big setter with all her puppies. What's this? It's a dog. It's a boy or girl. Long paws. Not very happy. Said, it could be the dad. Said, Jo, do you think it's the dad? She said, Aunt Lorna, can dogs be girls? What I'd like to suggest is that's how learning happens. Learning happens when what we believe to be true is challenged by new information that we cannot fit into the schema that we've developed to try to explain the world around us. That's how learning happens. And in this case, what I did was create the conditions for Joanna to see that what she believed to be true might not hold. I gave her feedback. I didn't give her feedback by telling her what was wrong with her thinking. I gave her feedback by creating the conditions where she could see that her thinking didn't apply as well as she thought it did. So think about it for a minute. What's your JoJo story? Think about something in your life that you believed to be true that was at some point challenged by new information. And you had to stand back and say, oh my God, isn't that silly? And we're going to ask you to share your stories if you'd be willing to do that, or at least a couple of you.
I don't know if mine's a fantastic example, but just when you mentioned it, it's the first thing I thought of. So just my own perspective on people with special needs. You know, I hadn't really encountered them on a personal level, or you know, I'd encountered them in my life, and you know, as a group, you know, and there's so many different special needs. You know, you can't group them together, and that's basically what I learned. My sister-in-law has Down syndrome, and just encountering her, she's a fantastic person, and just, you know, connecting with her on a personal level, you learn a lot about yourself and about people in general.
Yeah.
So
I think that's a great example. Having some preconceived notions that were not, because it wasn't part of your experience, you just take with you what you may know, and having the experience really changes it. Yeah. Anyone else? Yes.
Last year, my mother was living with us, and she was quite elderly. She was 90 years old, and as she started to decrease, we had to put her in a nursing home. And my 4-year-old daughter at the time was really quite upset that my mom was moving. And as it is, my mom passed away in the summer, and this is going back some time later. I wasn't feeling well, and I was laying on the couch, and my daughter came up to me and said, I'm going to take care of you, Mommy. She was covering me, and I'm going to take care of you because you don't want to get sick and go to the hospital. And I said, no, Mommy doesn't want to go to the hospital. No, because if you go to the hospital, you're going to die and go to heaven with Grandma. And I said, well, Annalisa, is that what happens all the time? Yeah, because Grandma went to with the nurses, and she went to heaven. And I said, well, but Mommy went to the hospital last year, and did she come home or did she go to heaven? And she came home, so it was sort of a learning moment for her.
Absolutely. Yes, good example. These are both, I think, excellent examples that capture that these are everyday parts of our lives. We have these all the time, views of the world that I like to think of as what I believe to be true. And we have this incredible capacity as human beings to believe that what I believe to be true is true. You know? And the fact that Rosa doesn't quite see the world the way I see the world is only because she doesn't know enough yet. If she knew what I knew, she would see it my way. Without really recognizing that every one of us sits with those same convictions about what we believe to be true. They just are what our experience has given us and what we come to see as the normal state of affairs that may not be shared widely or at all beyond some small groups or sometimes much larger groups, but are still those experientially created images of the world around us. So classroom assessment, doing assessment, actually has the potential for unlocking those kinds of things, finding out what it is people believe to be true. When I ask Joanna questions, when you ask your daughter questions, you're finding out what it is they believe to be true so that you're able to decide what you're going to do next, that you're going to give them feedback, that you're going to provide more information, you're going to create teachable moments. So more classroom assessment is not the answer. You know, just doing more is not enough. It's doing the right kinds. It's getting the kind of classroom assessment that actually allows you to use it for various purposes at different points in time, and to do it with all of the students in your class. That you're not teaching one-on-one, but what you want is to personalize or individualize learning. And you can use assessment to allow you to do that in a way that actually gives you images of what all the kids are thinking about and the way they're seeing the world around them. There are 3 different purposes of classroom assessment that I want to just highlight, and these are actually spelled out in much more detail in some of the resources that are part of the resource guide to this webcast. But the 3 purposes are assessment for learning, assessment as learning, and assessment of learning. Assessment for learning is when teachers use assessment to be able to understand what it is that youngsters are thinking so that you're able to decide what you're going to do next instructionally. Assessment as learning is actually a subset, if you like, of assessment for learning, but we've pulled it out separately as a separate idea because ultimately what you want are that children can actually self-assess. And by that I don't mean self-mark. You know, this isn't marking their own work. It is that they become good, self-reflective, self-monitoring thinkers in the way that if any of us write, as you write something, if you're writing a paper for a course or even writing a report, you read it and you think about, that's not quite what I wanted to say. You self-monitor, you go back, you rethink it, you add another idea, you reorganize it. That you want young people to become good self-monitors so that they're able to see where they need to go next or where they need to go for help and when they need to go for help. Because we want learning to be a process where they move as efficiently as possible through the learning continuum. We don't want kids to be stuck in misconceptions, misunderstandings, or inappropriate understandings of what it is they're trying to become knowledgeable about. We don't want them thinking many years later that if anyone goes to hospital, that means they're going to die. That can create all kinds of other almost unimaginable weirdnesses in their thinking over time. So assessment as learning is them becoming good at that themselves. Assessment of learning is what we typically do in classrooms. Assessment of learning is assessment almost for accreditation or for decision making. It's when we say, we're going to do a report for the parents, or we're going to do a decision about placement or decisions about promotion, that we need evidence to be able to make those judgments and make those judgments well. The graphic of the triangles shows two different triangles. One that is the, if you like, typical balance or current balance of assessment for, as, and of learning. And the other one is the one that I'd like to suggest we should be working toward. That at the moment, most of the assessment that we do in schools is assessment of learning. It is assessment with the purpose of reporting, communicating, accrediting, making those kinds of decisions. That most teachers do assessment for learning, as in they collect information about how kids are learning various concepts, often done informally, but you do it in order to decide what you're going to do next. And assessment as learning, intentionally working with young people to help them get good at judging their own learning, happens rarely. It's usually something that happens when it jumps out at you in a day, because teachers work through whole days of making constant decisions. You're making decisions in your lessons all the time, and you're changing the lessons depending on kids. What you may not be doing is working intentionally to create in them that capacity and the automaticity in monitoring their own work, thinking about where they need to go next, asking for help or getting help in a variety of ways. So I like to think that the balance should actually flip on its head, that assessment as learning should be the biggest part of the pyramid, that assessment for learning should sit on top of that, and that assessment of learning should actually happen fairly rarely. It may include a lot of evidence from across a whole term or a whole unit of work. It's not that you don't pay attention to all of the information you collect. It's that each time you do assessment, it is not a decision point. It can be a learning point. The next slide is called Planning the Assessment Process. And what I'd like to do is go through that slide just as it's an organizer, it's a way of thinking, to say when you're planning your assessment process, what should you be thinking about? Because you should always be assessing with the end in mind. What am I going to use this for? Why am I doing this assessing? So you start with, why am I assessing? What is the purpose? Am I assessing at the moment so I can decide what I'm going to do differently? Am I assessing so that I can help students become better at making decisions about their own learning? Or am I assessing because I have some communication I need to do, where I need some solid evidence to be able to do that and feel confident that I'm giving good information to someone else or making a good decision about this student? Once you know why you're assessing, and many of you will say, I do all of these things and I do them all and I mix them all up together. And in fact, you probably do. But as you try to actually deconstruct them, one of the things that happens is that when you do things for one purpose, you actually can make it hard for it to be useful for another. Now let me give you an example. If what I want to do is get kids to self-assess, if I want them to start self-monitoring or to be engaged in self-monitoring, and I'm going to mark that and it becomes part of what counts, why would I as a kid be even remotely willing to share with you, the teacher, what I don't understand? Why would I be willing to make that visible if you're going to use that against me when you mark me? So you need to create the conditions where kids can actually feel comfortable doing self-monitoring and not being right. Because in fact, lots of the time that we're learning, we're not right. That's what learning's about. If you knew it already, if it were already comfortable and automatic, then it wouldn't be part of what you're trying to accomplish. So you need to think about why you're assessing really clearly up front. Then you need to think about, what am I assessing? What are the curriculum targets? What are the skills? What is the content? What is it that I'm trying in this case to accomplish with this group of kids. Because if you aren't clear about what that is, you can be distracted by all kinds of other things that are going on. I'm going to give an example a bit about that in a minute. Then what assessment method will I use? Often asked, so what kinds of assessment methods do you use for assessment for, and what kinds of assessment methods do you use for assessment of? And the answer is all of them for all of them. There are not better assessment methods for each purpose. It's how you use the assessment that you do for the purpose that you intend. It's matching them. So you can use worksheets for assessment for learning. You can use tests to unlock what it is they believe to be true. It's not the form, that it's what you're trying to do with it, and then getting the best form for what it is you want to do. How can I assure quality? I'm going to come back to the quality question later, because I said earlier quality is an important piece of this that we really have to, I think, in education pay more attention to. That we actually don't necessarily think about the quality of our assessments as much as we might. Then what can I learn from this assessment? And you'll see there are two different tabs here. What can I learn from this assessment, and what am I going to do with it? Those are different things. What can I learn from it is what is it that I'm learning about this kid or group of kids learning? What is it I now know about how they learn that I didn't know before? Then, how am I going to use it? Is what does that trigger in terms of teaching strategies, resources, support, whatever kinds of things you might bring into the picture to decide how you're going to move on. So let me back up for a minute and talk about assessment for learning. Assessment for learning now is the one where teachers use the assessment to decide what they're going to do next. Identifying what it is they believe to be true. This is where you get specific information on each student's learning paths. I suspect you now in many of your classrooms have got assessment walls, and you're starting to track kids' learning as they move through. Is that true? Yeah? This is being clear. What are the curriculum outcomes? What are the things we're trying to accomplish? How does that show itself? How do I then make sense of that? It gives you detailed information on prior knowledge and on misconceptions and on errors in thinking. You need to know the learning progression. You need to know the common misconceptions. And you need to design the assessment to allow you to actually unpack that information. Here's a pretty good example of that. This is place value in decimals. It's the next slide. If you put a question on a worksheet that's place the following numbers in order of smallest to largest, and what you're after is the kid's understanding of place value. You've got 4 numbers there, 0.01, 0.67, 0.931, 0.32. I'm sure all of you can sit here and order them right now from smallest to largest. And you might from that assume, if kids could do that, that they understand place value. But if you look at those numbers and you take out all the decimals, it would order exactly the same way if all they did was look at them as if they were whole numbers. They don't have to understand place value to answer that question. The next one, however, select the largest number from the following list. The largest number, if they take out the decimals, is 125. The largest number, if they understand place value, is 1.4. So you need to construct assessment items so that they allow you to see the common misconceptions. What is it that kids would do if they didn't get this? And there may be 5 or 6 different ways that they could misunderstand place value. What you want to do is to be able to identify which ones have got the concept solidly in hand. Which ones don't get even decimals. Which ones perhaps understand a little bit about it, but they get confused when they have whole numbers and decimal places. Why do you want to do that? Because you can't teach every single kid one at a time. But you can teach 3 groups. that concept. By grouping those kids into those who need this kind of instruction, those who need that kind of instruction, those who need, even to go back to number facts, you can make those kinds of judgments if you create your assessment items in ways that they give you insight into what it is they believe to be true.